June 14, 1941, RAF Scampton, Lincolnshire, England. The morning light filtered through the hangar's skeletal framework, casting shadows across the Bristol Beaufighter's fuselage like prison bars. Flight Lieutenant James Caldwell stood beneath the aircraft's belly, staring at the turret mounting bracket with the intensity of a man who had seen too many friends burn in the sky over Hamburg. The mathematics were simple, brutal, and undeniable. German fighters attacked from below, always from below. The Luftwaffe had learned that the soft underbelly of a bomber was its grave, where armor was thinnest, where fuel tanks sat vulnerable, where gunners couldn't rotate fast enough to track a Messerschmitt climbing at 300 miles per hour through the blind spot. The Air Ministry's solution had been predictable. More dorsal guns, better top coverage, reinforced upper armor, more weight, less speed, more coffins with wings. Caldwell had lost 14 men in 6 months following that doctrine. He walked around the turret mount again, fingers tracing the cold metal, and saw what everyone else had missed. Not because they were stupid, but because they were certain. The turret faced upward because that's where turrets had always faced. He tilted his head and smiled, darkly. What if certainty itself was the enemy? The Royal Air Force of 1941 existed in a state of magnificent, desperate improvisation. Britain stood alone against the Reich's industrial colossus, its cities smoldering from the Blitz, its Atlantic convoys bleeding tonnage to U-boats, its bomber crews dying at rates that would have broken any peacetime military within weeks. The strategic bombing campaign was Britain's only offensive weapon, and it was hemorrhaging aircraft. The doctrine was sound on paper. Wellington and Sterling bombers would penetrate German airspace at night, strike industrial targets, return before dawn. Dorsal and tail gunners would provide interlocking fields of fire against pursuing fighters. Armor would protect vital systems. Numbers would ensure enough aircraft reached their targets. The reality was a charnel house in the clouds. German night fighters, Bf-110s equipped with early radar, flown by veterans of the Battle of France, had developed a tactic called Schräge Musik, upward-firing cannons that allowed them to approach undetected from below, position themselves beneath a bomber's belly, and fire directly into fuel tanks and bomb bays. No warning, no defense, just a sudden eruption of flame that consumed aircraft and crew in seconds. RAF losses climbed from 8% to 14%, then to 18%. Entire squadrons were being erased from the operational roster every month. The Air Ministry responded with typical institutional logic: thicker armor on top, additional upper turrets, higher operational altitudes, tighter formation flying. Each solution added weight, reduced speed, consumed fuel, and accomplished nothing except making the bombers more predictable. Caldwell had flown 23 missions as a navigator before transitioning to armament engineering. He had felt the thump of a 20mm cannon shell passing through the fuselage. He had watched the Lancaster beside him simply disintegrate. No explosion, just a sudden transition from aircraft to debris. 11 men transformed into statistics before they could scream. He understood what the analysts in their London offices did not. This wasn't a coverage problem. It was a geometry problem. The Germans attacked from below because bombers couldn't shoot down. Every gun pointed up, back, or sideways. The belly was a free fire zone. 10 feet of undefended aluminum between a Messerschmitt's cannons and 3,000 gallons of high-octane fuel. The solution wasn't more armor. It was a gun pointing at the wrong place. The first time Caldwell proposed it, the response was instantaneous and unanimous. Impossible. Wing Commander Harrison listened with the patience of a man who had reviewed 300 modification proposals in 6 months and approved none. Caldwell, a ventral turret creates unacceptable drag, limits bomb capacity, adds structural stress to the airframe, requires a dedicated gunner in the most vulnerable position imaginable, and solves a problem we're already addressing through altitude and formation discipline. Sir, altitude doesn't matter if they approach from below. Formation discipline doesn't matter if the guns can't traverse downward. We're defending the roof while they're coming through the basement. The engineering challenges alone are solvable. Sir, I've run the calculations. A modified Frazer-Nash turret reduced to 2 guns instead of 4, mounted in a retractable housing. Retractable. Harrison's voice was flat. You want to add mechanical complexity to an aircraft that's already pushing the limits of our manufacturing capacity. I want to stop losing 18% of every bomber stream. The silence was long and cold. We've lost 37 aircraft this month. Harrison finally said. 37. That's 407 men, sons, fathers, husbands. Do you know what the operational life expectancy is for a bomber crew right now? 14 missions. 14. Most of them don't make it to their 6th. I know, sir. And your solution is to add weight, drag, and mechanical failure points to aircraft that are already overloaded and underpowered. Caldwell met his eyes. My solution is to let them shoot back. Harrison stood, walked to the window overlooking the airfield where Wellingtons were being prepared for that night's raid. Young men, boys, really, climbing aboard machines that statistics said would kill them before winter. Write it up, Harrison said quietly. Full technical specifications, weight analysis, drag calculations, projected manufacturing timeline. If you can convince the Boffins at Farnborough that it's feasible, I'll take it to group. Caldwell nodded, already knowing that feasible wasn't the real barrier. The real barrier was that it contradicted everything the RAF had built its defensive doctrine upon. The real barrier was that being right meant admitting they'd been wrong, and hundreds had already died following the wrong doctrine. The real barrier was institutional pride wearing the face of tactical prudence. But he'd write it up anyway, because another 14 crews were climbing into their aircraft right now, and by dawn, 2 or 3 of them would be dead. September 3rd, 1941. RAF Farnborough, Research and Development Division. The prototype sat in the testing hangar like a mechanical heresy. A Wellington bomber with its belly carved open. A Frazer-Nash FN-64 turret mounted in a retractable ventral housing that lowered on hydraulic struts. 2. 303 Browning machine guns pointing downward at an angle that violated every aesthetic principle of aircraft design. It looked wrong, unbalanced, vulnerable. Dr. Emily Ashworth circled it with the critical eye of a physicist who had spent 3 years calculating wing loading and stress tolerances. It's hideous, she said, not unkindly. It's functional, Caldwell replied. Is it? You've added 240 pounds to the ventral structure, created a significant drag penalty in the extended position, introduced a failure point in the hydraulic system, and positioned a human being in what is essentially a glass coffin pointed at the ground, and given him a firing arc that covers the one approach vector we currently can't defend. Ashworth pulled out her calculations, pages of differential equations, stress analysis, aerodynamic modeling. Your drag coefficient increases by 18% when extended. Range drops by 30 miles. Ceiling drops by 800 feet. And if the hydraulic system fails in the extended position, the aircraft becomes unflyable. And if it works? She paused, then pulled out a different set of calculations, casualty reports, loss rates, statistical projections. The operational research section estimates that 73% of night fighter kills occur via Schregemusik attacks from the ventral approach. If your turret even marginally disrupts those tactics, we save lives. You might save lives. Or you might kill the gunner when a hydraulic line ruptures at 12,000 feet, flood the fuselage with oil, compromise the aircraft's handling, and create a failure mode that didn't exist before. Caldwell looked at the turret, then at Ashworth. Doctor, how many friends have you lost this year? The question was unfair and he knew it, but she didn't deflect. My brother, she said quietly. Navigator, Sterling, Hamburg raid, July 16th. They think it was a night fighter. He was 19. The hangar was silent except for the distant sound of engines being tested. Then help me make it work, Caldwell said. Ashworth looked at the prototype for a long moment and something shifted in her expression. Not acceptance, but the willingness to be convinced. Show me your hydraulic redundancy plan, she said. The resistance came not from physics, but from psychology. Fighter Command opposed it because it represented bomber innovation without fighter input. Bomber Command opposed it because it demanded manufacturing resources during a period of desperate aircraft shortage. The Air Ministry opposed it because it implied their previous defensive doctrine had been catastrophically wrong. But the mathematics were undeniable, and mathematics don't care about institutional pride. Squadron Leader Davies, a veteran of 38 missions and holder of the Distinguished Flying Cross, sat in the briefing room and listened to Caldwell's presentation with the weary skepticism of a man who had survived by trusting nothing. You're asking us to put a man in a glass bubble underneath the aircraft, Davies said, where he'll be directly exposed to ground fire during the bomb run, where he can't bail out if we're hit, where he'll be the first thing to hit the ground if we crash land. I'm asking you to give him a chance to shoot the fighter before it kills all of you, by making him the most vulnerable person on the aircraft. He's already the most vulnerable. Every man on a bomber is vulnerable. The question is whether we give them tools or just hope. Davies stood, walked to the window. Outside, ground crews were painting fresh squadron numbers on a Wellington, covering the numbers of an aircraft that hadn't returned from Cologne 3 nights before. I had a belly gunner once, he said quietly. On the old Hamptons before we phased them out. Young fellow from Cornwall, 22 years old, engaged to be married. First mission over France. We took ground fire during the approach. 20 military shell came through the ventral position, killed him instantly. We couldn't even retrieve his body until we landed. He turned back to Caldwell. You're not wrong about the geometry. You might even be right about the tactics. But you're asking men to volunteer for the position with the highest casualty rate on an aircraft that already has the highest casualty rate in the service. I know. And you think you'll find volunteers? Caldwell met his eyes. Sir, I think we'll have a waiting list. Davies looked at him for a long moment, then at the Wellington outside with its fresh paint covering old numbers. God help us, he said softly. You're probably right. December 1941, RAF Medmenham, Photographic Reconnaissance Unit. The intelligence reports arrived in fragments pieced together from prisoner interrogations, decoded Enigma intercepts, and reconnaissance photographs of Luftwaffe airfields. The Germans had noticed something. Lieutenant Commander Whitmore spread the photographs across the analysis table. A downed Wellington, photographed by German ground forces, its ventral turret clearly visible in the wreckage. Beside it, technical sketches recovered from a captured German intelligence report. They're calling it Bettschütze, Whitmore said. Bed shooter. Their fighter pilots are already circulating tactical bulletins. Caldwell leaned over the photographs. The Wellington had gone down over Belgium, crew killed on impact, but the turret was intact enough for German engineers to understand exactly what they were looking at. What's the assessment? Whitmore pulled out a decoded Luftwaffe communication. Night fighter crews are advised that some RAF bombers now carry ventral defensive armament. Recommend revised approach vector. Maintain altitude advantage. Attack from steep angle to minimize exposure time in lower firing arc. They're adapting. They're always adapting. But here's what's interesting. Whitmore pulled out casualty statistics. Since we introduced the first ventral turrets in October, overall bomber losses on German missions have dropped from 18% to 13%. That's not scientific certainty. Weather, moon phase, and target selection all vary, but the trend is consistent, because fighters can't be certain which bombers have the turret. Exactly. They're approaching all bombers with more caution now. Even the ones without ventral guns are benefiting from the uncertainty. Caldwell felt something shift in his chest. Not triumph, but the cold satisfaction of watching theory become reality. There's more, Whitmore said, pulling out another document. We've intercepted communications about German night fighter losses. Small numbers, but consistent. Fighters damaged or destroyed by defensive fire from unexpected vectors. The Luftwaffe is requesting armor modifications to protect against ventral attacks. They're spending resources defending against our defense. That's the game. We innovate, they counter-innovate, we counter their counter. But every month they're reacting to our changes is a month they're not developing their own improvements. Caldwell looked at the photographs of the downed Wellington, at the crew who had died but whose turret had already saved others. How many aircraft have the modification now? 47 operational, another 30 in production. Make it 100. February 1942, RAF Scampton, Operations Room. Sergeant Michael Brennan was 23 years old, had been married for 6 months, and had just volunteered for the ventral turret position. Caldwell interviewed him in the cramped operations office, the sound of engines warming up vibrating through the walls. You understand what you're volunteering for? Yes, sir. Ventral gunner. New turret system. Do you understand the position is non-ejectable? That if the aircraft is hit and going down, you won't be able to bail out? Brennan's face didn't change. I understand, sir. Do you understand that you'll be the first point of impact in a belly landing? I understand, sir. Caldwell put down his pen. Then help me understand why you'd volunteer for this. For the first time, Brennan's military composure cracked slightly. My brother was a rear gunner, sir. Halifax. Went down over Bremen in November. They think it was a night fighter from below. Tail gunner never saw it coming. I'm sorry. I don't want sympathy, sir. I want to shoot the bastard before he gets that close. Caldwell looked at the young man, at his wedding ring, at the determination in his eyes, at the mathematics of survival that had brought him to this moment. The ventral position has a higher casualty rate than any other crew position, Caldwell said quietly. Not because the turret is unsafe, but because you're the most exposed. Every attack from below will be aimed at you. Every piece of ground fire during the bomb run will pass through your position first. If we take damage and have to ditch in the channel, you'll drown before you can get out of the turret. I know, sir. And you still want the position? Brennan looked directly at him. Sir, every position on a bomber has a high casualty rate. At least this way I can do something about it. The logic was unassailable and heartbreaking. Caldwell signed the approval form, knowing he was sending this young man into the most dangerous position on the most dangerous aircraft in the most dangerous service of the war, and knowing that Brennan would save lives by being there. Report to Sergeant Williams for turret familiarization, Caldwell said. First operational flight is Tuesday. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. After Brennan left, Caldwell sat in the empty office and stared at the signature on the approval form. Sometimes being right felt worse than being wrong. May 1942. Cologne, Germany. Operation Millennium. First 1,000 bomber raid. The night sky over the Rhineland burned with a fury that could be seen from 70 miles away. 1,047 bombers. Every aircraft bomber command could make operational, stripped from training units, borrowed from Coastal Command, held together with determination and borrowed parts, converged on a single target in an operation designed to prove that strategic bombing could break Germany's industrial capacity. Among them were 63 Wellingtons equipped with ventral turrets. Flight Lieutenant Davies led a formation of 12 aircraft through the firestorm, the sky around him illuminated by searchlights, burning buildings, and the tracers of flak batteries that turned night into deadly daylight. His ventral gunner, Sergeant Brennan, hunched in the turret sphere, watching the darkness below through the Perspex dome. Belly gunner, any movement? Negative, skipper. Lots of searchlights, no fighters yet. The bomb run was chaos. Aircraft stacked at different altitudes, bomb flashes creating momentary blindness. The air so turbulent from heat and explosions that keeping formation was nearly impossible. Then Brennan's voice, sharp. Fighter, closing from 5 o'clock low. A Bf-110 stalking them through the smoke, positioning itself beneath the formation where gunners couldn't depress their weapons enough to engage. Except now they could. Engaging! The ventral turret spun, hydraulics whining, and Brennan fired. A 3-second burst that raked across the fighter's approach path. The Messerschmitt banked hard, abandoning its attack run, dropping away into the darkness. He's breaking off. Did you hit him? Don't know, skipper, but he's not coming back. Across the bomber stream, the scene repeated. Night fighters approaching from below, finding themselves under fire from an unexpected vector, breaking off attacks that had always been free kills. Some were hit, damaged, forced to withdraw. Others simply refused to press attacks against uncertain odds. The ventral turrets didn't need to destroy fighters. They only needed to make the hunters hesitate. By dawn, Bomber Command had lost 40 aircraft, 4% of the attacking force. Horrific by any civilian standard, but the lowest loss rate for a major German raid in months. In the debriefing room, Davies found Caldwell reviewing the preliminary reports. It worked, Davies said simply. Caldwell nodded, exhausted. Now we need 100 more. Now, Davies corrected, we need to make sure we don't get complacent. The Germans will adapt, they always do. Both men understood. This was only one move in an endless game of lethal chess. 1942. Bletchley Park, Cryptanalysis Center. The decoded Enigma messages arrived with ultra-classification. Intelligence so sensitive that only a handful of officers were cleared to read them. Among them was Wing Commander Caldwell, newly promoted and transferred to Bomber Tactical Development. The German High Command was panicking. Not openly, not in ways that would show in propaganda or public communications, but in the technical language of logistics, production priorities, and tactical directives that flowed through their military communications network. All available FUG-202 radar units to be prioritized for night fighter squadrons. Armored plating for ventral fighter protection to be expedited. Revised tactical doctrine for Nachtjagd operations against RAF heavy bombers. Maintain altitude separation. Avoid prolonged exposure to lower defensive zones. The intelligence officer presenting the briefing looked exhausted. They're reorganizing their entire night fighter doctrine. Not because we're destroying their aircraft. We're not in significant numbers, but because we've introduced enough uncertainty that their previous free fire zone no longer exists. Caldwell studied the intercepts, seeing the second and third order effects of a simple geometric innovation. German aircraft production was being diverted to add armor. Radar development was being accelerated. Pilot training was being modified. All of it consuming resources, time, and industrial capacity that might otherwise have been directed to offensive operations. There's more, the intelligence officer said, pulling out a different document. We've identified a German program to develop their own ventral guns, not for bombers but for night fighters. They're designing upward-firing cannon systems that would allow them to attack from below while still being able to defend against our ventral turrets. They're innovating to counter our innovation. That's the assessment. And here's where it gets interesting. American bomber crews are requesting information on the ventral turret system. The B-17 and B-24 have ball turrets, but the mounting system is different, and they're losing aircraft to the same tactics over occupied Europe. Caldwell felt the implications ripple outward. What had started as a local modification to address a specific problem was becoming part of the Allied air doctrine. Knowledge was spreading, tactics evolving, advantages being shared across national boundaries because the mathematics of survival transcended politics. Prepare technical specifications for transfer to 8th Air Force, Caldwell said. If they're fighting the same enemy, they need the same tools. The intelligence officer nodded. Sir, there's one more thing. We've intercepted communications suggesting the Germans are impressed with the innovation. One of their technical officers called it typically British. Solving an inelegant problem with an inelegant solution that somehow works. Caldwell smiled grimly. I'll take that as a compliment. January 1943, RAF High Wycombe, Bomber Command Headquarters. The war had entered its 4th year, and the strategic bombing campaign had become a contest of industrial attrition. Germany's capacity to produce fighters, flak guns, and radar against Britain's capacity to produce bombers, train crews, and absorb losses. The ventral turret had become standard equipment on Wellington and Halifax bombers, with Lancaster conversions in progress. Loss rates had stabilized at 11%, still catastrophic, still unsustainable in the long term, but better than the 18% of 1941. Air Chief Marshal Harris reviewed the operational statistics with the focused intensity of a man who commanded an air force that was simultaneously Britain's primary offensive weapon and its primary source of casualties. The ventral turret modification has been tactically successful, he said, his voice carrying the weight of 4,000 dead aircrew. But strategic success requires more than tactical innovation. We need to break the German night fighter force entirely. Caldwell, now a wing commander and senior tactical advisor, understood what Harris was suggesting. Escalation. Not just defensive innovation, but offensive operations designed to destroy the Luftwaffe's night fighter capability at its source. Airfields, radar stations, production facilities. The Germans have adapted their tactics, Caldwell said. They're attacking from steeper angles, using radar to avoid visual detection until the last moment, coordinating with ground-based searchlights. The ventral turret gives us a fighting chance, but it's not a decisive advantage. Then what is? Numbers. Coordination. Electronic countermeasures. We're in an innovation race, sir, and the side that stops innovating loses. Harris studied the casualty reports. Pages of names, squadrons, aircraft types, causes of loss. 11% meant that of every 100 aircraft dispatched, 11 failed to return. Statistically, that meant no crew would survive their required tour of 30 operations. The Americans will be conducting daylight raids starting this spring, Harris said. Unescorted initially, until they build up fighter forces. They'll learn what we learned, that bombers, no matter how well armed, cannot survive determined fighter opposition without support. We should share everything we've learned. Ventral turret specifications, tactical doctrine, loss analysis. We will, because this isn't about national pride anymore. It's about whether strategic bombing can accomplish its mission before we run out of crews willing to fly. The room was silent except for the sound of rain against the windows. How many aircraft are operational tonight? Harris asked. 743, sir. And how many will return? Caldwell didn't answer because they both already knew. Not all of them. March 7, 1943. Berlin, Germany. Deep penetration raid. The bomber stream stretched across 200 miles of hostile airspace. Each aircraft a small constellation of navigation lights in the darkness, each one carrying 7 men who knew the statistics and flew anyway. Sergeant Brennan, promoted to flight sergeant after 18 completed operations, sat in his ventral turret as they crossed into German airspace. Below, The landscape was invisible except for occasional flak bursts and the distant glow of blacked-out cities. Target in 40 minutes, Davies announced. Flak expected heavy night fighters probable. The intercom crackled with reports from other aircraft. Fighter, breaking left. Hit! We're hit! Bail out, bail out, bail out! Then Brennan saw it. A shape moving below them, slightly darker than the surrounding night, pacing the bomber at a careful distance. Contact. Night fighter, 7 o'clock low, range 600 yards. Can you engage? Not yet. He's staying out of range, probably waiting for us to be distracted by flak. The Messerschmitt shadowed them for 3 minutes, and Brennan understood the German pilot's calculation. Wait for the bomber to be illuminated by searchlights during the bomb run, then attack while the crew was focused on the target. The flak began as they approached Berlin. Walls of explosions that turned the sky into a maze of deadly geometry. The Wellington bucked and shuddered, and somewhere behind them an aircraft took a direct hit, disintegrating in a flash that burned purple afterimages into Brennan's vision. The fighter moved in. He's coming! Closing fast! Brennan rotated the turret, tracking the shape as it climbed toward their vulnerable underside, exactly as hundreds of German pilots had done, exactly as the RAF's defensive doctrine had been unable to prevent. Except this time, the bomber shot back. Brennan fired. A sustained burst that walked tracers across the night fighter's approach path. He saw strikes, bright sparks against the Messerschmitt's wing, and the fighter rolled hard left, abandoning the attack. He's breaking off. I think I hit him. Stay sharp. He might come around. But the fighter didn't return. Damaged or cautious, it vanished into the darkness, and the bomber continued to Berlin, dropped its payload, turned for home. 23 aircraft were lost that night. Davies's crew wasn't among them. In the debriefing room, Brennan filled out his combat report with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline and exhaustion. Did you destroy the fighter? The intelligence officer asked. No, sir. Probable damage. He broke off the attack. The officer made a notation. Mission accomplished, Brennan thought. Not because he'd killed the enemy, but because he'd made the enemy choose not to kill them. May 1943. RAF station. Debriefing of German prisoner. The Luftwaffe pilot was young, 24, veteran of 63 night missions, holder of the Iron Cross Second Class. His Bf-110 had been shot down by a Spitfire during a daylight reconnaissance mission, and now he sat in the interrogation room with the weary professionalism of a man who knew the war was far from over. Wing Commander Caldwell sat across from him, not as interrogator, but as technical consultant. The conversation was conducted in careful English and German, each man probing the other's understanding. Your ventral turrets, the German pilot said. We call them Himmelsaugen, sky eyes. They see what should not be seen. You've encountered them? Twice. The first time I pressed the attack. Second time I did not. He looked directly at Caldwell. You understand. It is not fear. It is mathematics. The approach vector that was safe, where we could position ourselves and fire without return fire, no longer exists. Now every approach carries risk. So we calculate, is this target worth exposing my aircraft and crew? And the answer? Sometimes yes, often no. The RAF has not made night fighting impossible. You have made it expensive. That is perhaps more effective. Caldwell felt a strange kinship with this enemy pilot. Both of them professionals solving the same geometric problem from opposite sides. Both of them keenly aware that lives depended on their calculations. Your command is adapting, Caldwell said. Steeper attack angles, better radar, coordinated tactics. The German smiled faintly. And you will adapt to our adaptations. This is the nature of technical warfare. Neither side can afford to remain static. Do you think strategic bombing can win the war? The question was beyond the scope of a tactical interrogation, but the German considered it seriously. I think neither side can win by bombing alone, but you can certainly lose by failing to bomb. Your campaign forces us to divert resources, protect targets, maintain defensive fighters that might otherwise be used offensively. You create uncertainty, and uncertainty is expensive. After the pilot was escorted back to the detention facility, Caldwell sat in the empty room and thought about the strange mathematics of war. Success measured not in victories but in resources consumed, in enemies made cautious, in attacks that never happened because the cost was too high. The ventral turret hadn't won the air war. It had simply made losing it slower, and in 1943, with victory still years away, slower meant survival. August 1943. Air Ministry, London. Strategic Review. The conference room held 30 officers representing every branch of the RAF's bombing campaign: tacticians, engineers, intelligence analysts, operational commanders. On the wall, a massive chart tracked loss rates from 1940 to present. The curve had bent, not dramatically, not decisively, but measurably, from 18% in 1941 to 11% in 1943. Extrapolated across 2 years of operations, that 7 percentage point difference represented approximately 800 aircraft not lost, 5,600 airmen not killed. Air Chief Marshal Harris stood before the assembled officers and spoke with the cold precision of a man who measured success in lives saved rather than enemies killed. The ventral turret modification represents the most successful defensive innovation of the strategic bombing campaign, not because it revolutionized air combat, but because it introduced uncertainty into a tactical equation the enemy had solved. The Germans can no longer approach with impunity from below. That single fact has altered the calculus of night fighting across the entire theater. He gestured to Caldwell. Wing Commander Caldwell's insight was not that we needed better guns or heavier armor. His insight was that we had been defending the wrong geometry. Every defensive doctrine, every tactical manual, every training protocol assumed fighters would attack from above and behind. We built our defenses around that assumption. We were wrong. The room was silent. The larger lesson, Harris continued, is that institutional certainty can be as dangerous as enemy action. We knew how air combat worked. We had decades of experience, thousands of combat reports, the best engineering minds in Britain, and we were systematically defending the wrong approach vector because we could not imagine we were wrong. He paused. Let the words settle. Wing Commander Caldwell imagined it. He tilted a turret to what everyone said was the wrong side, and created a defensive capability that has saved thousands of lives, not by being brilliant, but by being willing to question certainty. Caldwell stood uncomfortable with the recognition and said the only thing that mattered. Sir, we need to keep innovating. The Germans are adapting. Our advantage is temporary. If we become certain again, certain that the ventral turret is sufficient, certain that our current tactics are optimal, we'll lose the very flexibility that made this work. Harris nodded grimly. Agreed. Complacency is defeat in slow motion. The meeting continued into tactical details, but the essential truth had been established. The war would be won not by those who were certain, but by those who remained willing to doubt. November 1945. Imperial War Museum, London. Post-war technical exhibition. The ventral turret sat in a glass case, removed from a Wellington bomber that had completed 73 operational missions without loss. Small, ungainly, its perspex dome scratched and yellowed by age and stress, it looked less like a revolutionary weapon than a desperate improvisation, which, Caldwell reflected, it had been. The museum curator had asked him to write a placard explaining its significance. He'd struggled with the text for weeks, trying to capture something more profound than technical specifications. What he finally wrote: this turret was installed in RAF bombers from 1941-1945. It did not win the air war. It did not revolutionize aerial combat. What it did was give bomber crews a fighting chance against an attack vector that had previously been indefensible. By pointing guns at what traditional doctrine considered the wrong side, it introduced uncertainty into enemy tactics and saved an estimated 5,600 Allied lives. The innovation was not in the technology. Gun turrets existed long before 1941. The innovation was in questioning an assumption so fundamental that it had become invisible, that defensive guns should point at the direction enemies were expected to attack from, rather than the direction they actually were attacking from. War, like all human endeavors, is shaped more by our assumptions than by our capabilities. Victory often belongs not to those who fight harder, but to those who are willing to see what others cannot, not because the truth is hidden, but because certainty has made us blind. He stood in the empty museum hall, remembering faces. Sergeant Brennan, who survived the war and returned to Cornwall. Dr. Ashworth, who went on to develop radar countermeasures. Wing Commander Davies, killed over Hamburg in 1944, 3 missions short of completing his tour. The German pilot whose name he never learned, who understood that they were all trapped in the same terrible mathematics. The war had ended 4 months ago. Britain had survived, though changed in ways that would take decades to fully understand. The strategic bombing campaign had contributed to victory, though at a cost that would haunt survivors forever. And somewhere in the accumulated data, the casualty reports, the technical specifications, was a small but measurable fact. A gun pointed at the wrong side had made the difference between 18% losses and 11% losses. 7 percentage points, 5,600 lives. Sometimes Caldwell thought, being willing to look foolish was the most courageous thing a person could do. He left the museum as evening fell over London, the city's lights returning after 6 years of blackout, and walked home through streets that no longer feared bombers overhead. The war had taught him many things, but the lesson he carried most deeply was this: certainty is the enemy of survival, and the willingness to doubt is the beginning of wisdom.